Welcome to Alberta Conservation Association's Harvest Your Own podcast, the resource for everything hunting, navigating through the field, the butcher shop, and the kitchen. Life is all about great food. Let's get started.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Brad Fenson, an avid outdoor enthusiast who has worked as a freelance journalist, photographer, and public speaker for over 3 decades. I have hunted, fished, and foraged all my life and hope to share my passion for the outdoors. Along the way, I want to encourage everyone to harvest wild proteins and enjoy the satisfaction of providing the next meal for your family. Our goal is to educate, entertain, and inspire individuals to get outdoors and create a connection between food, health, and your future meals. Welcome to Harvest Your Own. Today we're going to tackle a topic that has been on people's minds for the last couple of years, and that's avian influenza. And we have a specialist, a virologist from the University of Saskatchewan, Mr. Bryce Warner. How are you this morning, Bryce?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Yeah, I think lots of people have questions about influenza, and I understand that in your line of work, you're more or less an expert on it.
Yeah, so what we do here at VIDO Summit, the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, what we do is, we study avian influenza, really in the context of, how it's changing, how it's infecting humans, how it might infect humans, the disease, and then more recently, how it's impacting dairy cattle, which has been going on in the U.S. So we've been studying that, and then, working on therapeutics and vaccines, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, it seems to be ever changing. Let's start with a little bit about yourself. Obviously, you work at the university. What is a virologist?
So, virology is a pretty broad term, but, for what I do and my interests, I study high consequence viruses. So high path avian influenza is one of them. I study hantaviruses, another zoonotic disease. And I've worked with coronaviruses and then some other serious ones like Ebola, Lassa fever. But what I do mostly is animal model development and studying disease pathogenesis and how the viruses make animals and humans sick, and then I use those models to test and develop vaccines. So I'm mostly in vaccine and disease development.
Right. Well, it's a very interesting situation, and it's tied very closely to our economy. I mean, instances of bird flu have created shortages of fowl and eggs and all kinds of things. And now that it's moving into dairy cattle and some cases in humans, it's creating more alarm, and reaching even further than what most people ever expected.
Yeah. Yeah. The economic impact. I mean, right now, in the U.S. and Georgia, it's really devastating to the laying population there, and so they're seeing the effects, in their egg prices, and it's people have been asking for years, sort of when it's going to die down, and it just hasn't yet, and I don't know if there's an end in sight at this point. So
right. It's interesting. I watch it pretty carefully because I love bird hunting, and I watch them in the spring when they come back, in the fall when they're migrating. I travel through the states and hunt. I've seen lots of cases of avian influenza and how birds react, but is there things that the public and hunters should be concerned about with the virus?
Yeah, I think there's always some level of concern. I wouldn't say that it's a huge concern and a huge risk for hunters or anyone who's out in the outdoors and might be interacting with wildlife. As long as you know sort of what the signs are, that what you should be aware of and how to keep an eye on things. So what I would say is that generally speaking, the risk is low to hunters and people who are outdoors. But if you know what the disease signs in infected animals look like, and that would include birds and other mammals as well, like carnivores, like foxes or other species you might come in contact with, then you can know, what to avoid and how to protect yourself. And so I think, that's really probably going to be the key message. And I can, maybe go into a little bit more detail about that, but I think generally speaking, the risk is still fairly low as long as you know what to look for.
Right. What are some of the symptoms that people should watch for? Is it obvious when a bird has the flu?
Yeah. So the virus is carried by ducks and waterfowl, and some of those species aren't affected. So you wouldn't know. They carry the virus, and it's in their feces and things, and that's how the virus spreads. But if it does end up infecting a susceptible animal, other different species of ducks or geese or pheasants or something like that, they can show severe signs. So one of the major ones is neurological signs, and so that most of the species that do succumb or after they become infected, they do develop neurological disease, and so that is usually fairly obvious. And if you look it up online, you can find videos of various bird species that are infected, and you can tell there's something wrong with their brain. They can't walk, they can't fly, they try to fly and flap their wings and they can't, and it's very clear and obvious. And if you ever did see a bird that had those signs, I think you would know. And then that would be, definitely those are birds you want to stay away from. Obviously, if you see dead birds that are on the ground already, or birds that are nearing death, those would be ones to avoid as well. Just because you'd have to just assume that maybe they're going to be infected. And not even with avian influenza, if a bird's been dead for a while, there'd be other pathogens that you wouldn't want to have to deal with too. So, but I think the main sign would be, the neurological disease is the main one.
Yeah, and I think I've seen it several times where the birds have trouble standing. Their head is, it appears like it's almost heavy, like it swings like a pendulum. They can't walk properly. They're falling over. They're just very disorientated. And, the best way I can talk about it is if you had a severe case of the flu, you know how you feel. You don't want to get out of bed. You can't move. You're groggy, woozy, just feeling terrible. And that's exactly what those birds look like.
Yeah.
But, it's interesting on a couple of the spring snow goose hunts we've been on over the years, we could tell when a bird came in that had symptoms as well. There'd be a single bird fly in, it would be low, its feet would be hanging down, it would be wobbling in the air, and it wouldn't have a very graceful landing if we let it finish its flight. It would sort of come tumbling to the ground, and it was obvious that there was something wrong with it. So as hunters, we could also keep an eye out for things like that because there are symptoms. There are the birds just don't act normal. There's something about them that's very weakened, and you can see it.
Yeah, and if you're an experienced hunter and you've been dealing with birds and watching them for years, like you said, you would notice if something's out of the ordinary, and that would be a situation where at least you can suspect that there's an infection, and that would be those would be birds to avoid, I'm sure.
Right. So when we look at the avian influenza, it's called H5N1 originally. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, so the naming and the nomenclature is, I can just describe that a little bit. I mean, so highly pathogenic avian influenza is more of a broad term that can apply to different avian influenzas. H5N1 is really the main one that people think of, and it's the main one to be worried about now because that's the one that's been circulating globally for 4 or 5 years now. The H5N1 is the subtype of the virus, so that's just how we name the proteins that are on the surface of the virus. A highly pathogenic aspect of it is really just a description of the phenotype and what happens when it infects birds. And so that's really, it's called highly pathogenic because when it gets into poultry, which are the main susceptible species, so poultry our chickens and turkeys are really impacted significantly by the virus. So when they get infected, they die in large numbers. And so, we call it highly pathogenic because it readily kills poultry species, not necessarily because it kills wild birds and ducks and that sort of thing. Although once it gets into those species, it can be very severe. But the naming is really based on the outcome that we see in poultry species. and then, the numbering is just specific to the virus. And, that's not necessarily something that the general public needs to worry about, although there are, a number of variants of the virus now that are circulating that have different, there's H5N5, for example. But in terms of, what people need to worry about, I think just, generally speaking, they're more or less the same. There are other subtypes out there too. But yeah, H5N1 is certainly the most common.
Right. I think I saw it on the news last week or the week before. There was an H5N9. Is that correct? Like it's just a variant of the same flu bug. Yeah,
and that's the same, basically the same virus that was in California. And so really that N protein, so in H5N1, it's an N1, and then when the virus circulates, and if it infects an animal that is already infected with another flu, then they can swap genes, and then you end up with another virus that you swap the N1 for an N9. And that can sometimes have a big impact and sometimes not. So, that's what we study in the lab really is how those changes impact transmission and disease and things like that.
Would it be fair to say it's a mutation of the virus?
A mutation would be more so a change in the individual gene. So like the N1, would always be changing over time. When the virus swaps genes with a different virus, we call that reassortment. So it's a reassortant of the virus. So if you go from an H5N1 to an H5N9, that's a reassortment event. And there's 8 different genes in the virus. And so if you get 2 viruses infecting the same animal, you can get any different combination of those 8 genes. And so it can get pretty complicated quickly. And so that's why, we're always doing surveillance and looking to see what genes are present in each virus and how that's changing over time and which ones are, predominating and which ones might result in more disease and which ones might be more transmissible, that sort of thing.
This podcast is produced for Harvest Your Own, a program dedicated to those who want to reconnect with food and health through their experiences outdoors. HarvestYourOwn.ca is a resource for individuals to learn more about hunting and the outdoors. There's information to get you started and ensure that your compass stays pointed in the right direction to be successful. Where's your next meal coming from?
It's very interesting to discuss viruses and, what they are, how they change and all the rest of it. But do the symptoms within the bird population change as the virus does?
That's a good question. So, again, it's complicated because it really depends on the species and the virus. And so the virus sort of, starts out as, when it was first discovered, decades ago, and how it generally circulates is just as a benign infection in certain waterfowl species. And then when it gets into poultry, then it causes systemic infection and it results in disease and it kills most of the birds. And then when it finds its way into other birds, it can cause the neurological disease like I discussed. And there's always going to be some level of efficiency of that happening depending on the virus. And then, as the virus evolves over time, it might get better at infecting the brain of some birds. It might get worse. And it's always changing. But generally, as long as the virus sort of maintains, the same capabilities it originally had, it'll sort of always be able to severely impact certain species. And that's kind of, the baseline level, at least for most of the birds that are susceptible.
Yeah, it's interesting. What makes birds susceptible? It becomes very neurologic, as you mentioned, but with the flu bug, they get a lot of sinus discharge. You can see they've got mucus just like we do when we have a bad cold. Does it go to their brain from there or into their blood system or into the nervous system some other way?
Yeah. So in at least in poultry, influenza is more of a gastrointestinal infection. So it's spread through the fecal oral route. So they'll poop it out and then other birds will ingest it and then they'll get infected. What makes highly pathogenic influenza interesting and different is that there's differences in the protein that I mentioned, so the H5. So there's changes in that protein that allow the virus to spread throughout the body to different organs. So if a chicken or a turkey gets infected with a low path virus, it'll probably just be a gut, a stomach infection, and they'll be okay. Maybe they're a little bit sick, but if they get infected with the high path version of the virus will spread to the liver, the heart, the lungs, the spleen, and then into the brain eventually, and that causes all sorts of issues, obviously. And what allows birds to be sick is the receptors on cells that the virus uses to enter. And so what is different about avian influenza versus human seasonal influenza is the receptors that the virus uses to cause the infection. So when the avian influenza H5N1, it uses what we call an alpha-2/3 receptor, and this is the predominant receptor in birds. And so chickens and most avian species have this receptor, in their guts and on most of their cells, and so that makes them highly susceptible to this virus. Whereas humans, we don't really have that receptor. We have a different receptor called 2/6 in our upper airway. We do have 2/3 in the lower airway, right, down deep in the lung, and so that that's a distinct difference. And so that's why that's a distinguishing factor between an avian virus versus a human. So birds are highly susceptible, whereas we're not so much. And so that we're always watching the virus to see how it's mutating and how that might impact humans and mammals versus birds.
All right. So it also explains why some species of birds carry it but don't get infected. They must have different receptors and pick up the disease and deal with it in different ways.
Yeah, and it's it's a receptor question, and there are hundreds of these receptors that can aid in entry of the virus, and then there's also other factors in individual hosts. So yeah, things like ducks, certain duck species that don't get sick, they have different host factors, and their immune system is able to, prevent disease from occurring, whereas that doesn't happen in the susceptible species.
Yes, it's all very interesting. Can birds develop some type of an immunity to it, or is it just has to always run its course?
That's a good question. If there's been some studies that I've seen, and I know some people have done that, and they try to track, antibody levels in wild bird populations over time, and they do show that, you can see really high levels of the virus in bird populations, and then it'll go down, and then it might go back up again. So I think it suggests that, in certain species where, in animals that don't die, they do develop an immune response that is probably protective to some degree. It just, again, it's very difficult to study that because wild bird field studies are difficult to carry out. And people are, it's sad to say, people are more concerned about, domestic poultry operations and economic loss and those sorts of things rather than wild animals. But I think wild animals are more on people's radar now with the situation that's been happening. So
right.
We might learn a bit more about that moving forward.
Right. It's interesting to see how it's, I don't know what the right word is, how it's come to impact other species. Alaska had a case where a black bear ended up with avian influenza and caused neurological problems within the brain. I've heard stories about white-tailed deer also catching avian influenza in different parts of the states. And when that occurs, whether it's in a dairy cattle or wild animals, are they then able to transmit that disease as well, or do they just carry it for a while and it fades out?
Yeah. It's hard to say. They certainly can transmit it onward. When in my previous position, when I was in Winnipeg, I worked closely with CFIA scientists, and they did a lot of work on, every wild animal and every domestic animal that gets infected. It goes through their building there in Winnipeg, and we were getting isolates from a really wide range of species, like skunks, foxes, bears, dolphins, everything you could think of, and then eventually into cows in the U.S. And the question of transmission is really a question of timing, and if birds are infected and they die, or other smaller animals, and if they die and then they get scavenged by, vultures have been affected to a larger degree in the U.S. and elsewhere. I think just because, obviously they're scavengers and they're going to pick up the virus if it's in dead animals. But that happens also with carnivores as well, and in raptor species too. So the virus can be transmitted to animals that way, through ingestion. In something like, a deer, it's a similar, deer are susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 infection, and they shed the virus. But with this virus, it's just a matter of timing. The kinetics and the replication of the virus and how it's shed in some of these species isn't really well known, except for now in dairy cattle, we know that the virus is found in really high levels in the milk. And so that's a risk. And there's been quite a few human exposures and infections linked to, milk exposure in dairy workers, that sort of thing. So it really is, species specific, where the virus is replicating, in what sites is it being shed, in their feces, in their nasal secretions. Are they dying? And then if they're dying, are they getting scavenged and picked up by another species like a carnivore, that sort of thing. So it's a complex interplay of the ecology of all the species. So.
Yeah, it's very interesting to look at, and it's pretty easy to understand how it can be transmitted. If it's the flu bug and it's done through feces, or a dead bird itself getting scavenged by, a lot of people in Alberta say our raven population is down. Well, that could be, due to avian influenza if the raven is susceptible to the disease itself. But, I haven't heard of coyotes getting it. They seem to be pretty much immune to anything. Black bears obviously ingesting a dead bird. Cattle, lots of birds head into the feedlots and share a feed with them, and there's feces on their feed. I can see how they can pick it up pretty easy. The transmission through milk, though, is interesting, and it might explain why some people can come down with avian influenza. I would imagine that you'd explain that as a very low risk, though, in terms of people being able to get it. And if so, could it be deadly as well, or is it manageable?
Yeah. So what we're seeing now, at least in North America, there's been, in this ongoing panzootic, there's been, one case in Canada so far, that's it. And then in the U.S., there's been about 70 or so. I don't know. I don't think they've been updating their online dashboards as often now since the election, or since Trump took over, but that, there have been more and more cases in humans. About half of those, I think, have been linked to milk exposure in dairy workers. Most of the other ones are linked to, exposure to poultry, infected poultry, and those are poultry workers. There's been at least a few that I know that are, unknown exposures. And so it's hard to say. Those could have been, exposures to birds, wild birds. It could have been exposure to poultry. If the person doesn't recall seeing an animal, then it's hard to say. But the vast majority of the human cases that have been confirmed so far are linked to, either dairy or poultry. The case in Canada, that was a teenager who had exposure to birds. And so, the risk is low, but it is occurring. There's been one death so far in the U.S. One person was exposed to poultry. And what is interesting, though, with the human cases so far in North America, is that the case fatality rate is quite low. So there's only been the one fatality so far. The case in BC, that person was severely sick. They were in intensive care, but they did recover. But historically, at least in China and Southeast Asia, the case fatality rate is about 50%. And so we're not sure what's different about the virus that's circulating now and causing a lot milder disease in humans versus the historical virus that kills about 50% of people. And it's probably a combination of the true incidence rate in people is much higher, and so you're only detecting the severe diseases, and so you're overestimating the fatality rate a bit. It could be differences in the population's immunity to flu. There's differences between, the North American population and the population in Asia, and then differences in the exposure routes. Those are mostly poultry workers on really large operations, and versus here with dairy and that, and then possibly changes in the virus itself, which could account for something. So there's a lot of potential ways that it's different, and we're trying to study that.
This podcast was made possible by Alberta Conservation Association and the Harvest Your Own community. If you're interested in harvesting your own food, there's a comprehensive collection of information to gain insight and knowledge. Head to the field, harvest your own protein, prepare it, and taste the results. HarvestYourOwn.ca is a library of information from getting started and geared up to processing, butchering, and cooking wild game to make the connection between health and food.
Well, you've done an excellent job of telling us about the virus, how it's changed, how it impacts different species, especially birds, the risk to humans. And the message that our listeners really are interested in is, do bird hunters need to be concerned about avian influenza? What's their risk?
Like I said before, I think the risk is relatively low. I mean, it's not zero, certainly. I mean, the virus is circulating in a lot of species. It wouldn't be unheard of to come across birds that are infected, certainly. So I think, just having an awareness is critical, and knowing what to look for. There's definitely some precautions that you could take when you're hunting, whether it's, watching for these clinical signs, and if you see anything out of the ordinary, avoiding those animals. And then also, once you have, hunted your birds and you're collecting them and you're, dressing them and plucking them, that sort of thing, is just being aware of the possibility of a risk, and just, taking biosafety measures in terms of, wearing gloves and, having dedicated gloves and clothes and boots and things that you use when you're doing that sort of, when you're dressing the animals and that sort of thing. And then, immediately changing out of those and avoiding, don't touch your face, and like all the things we talked about with COVID really is just, infection prevention, that sort of thing would be critical. And then, avoid getting, the feces and blood and secretions, on yourself as best as you can. And then, immediately cleaning yourself and all the clothes and things that you were wearing when you're handling the birds. And then, there's, if the birds happen to have been infected, as long as you're taking precautions and careful when you're preparing them, I think that's probably okay. And then, cooking meat thoroughly, kills the virus if there happens to be any meat, in there that is infected. So I think that's another thing to be aware of too. I'm sure people are hopefully thoroughly cooking their meat for foodborne illness prevention anyways, but that's another way to help prevent infection too.
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing that stands out to me is wearing gloves, and especially avoiding the feces. And one of the biggest problems is waterfowl hunting is very social. So we tend to get in a blind and have thermoses of coffee and extra food and sandwiches, and you're handling birds, you're eating at the same time. And I think that is the one thing that we really got to be paying more attention to. I never used to carry sanitary wipes in my blind bag, but I certainly do now. And it's, if you get messy hands, it's a good thing to not wait, but clean up now, and wait till you get a chance to wash before you dig into the food and stuff as well. I think those are probably some of the bigger ones. The other problem that we have with waterfowl is, over the years, we've been told over and over that in order to enjoy the flavors and the tenderness of a bird, to cook it medium rare is recommended. But, there are lots of recipes out there when you can cook it well done and still do different things with it and make it extremely palatable without losing flavor and tenderness in different ways. Yeah.
And if that's, I think that those are precautions that make sense to me. And that what you brought up is a interesting and important point too. Yeah. Like if you're hanging around and you're, handling the animals, just to be aware of, don't go directly from touching the bird to touching your sandwich and your coffee and that sort of thing. I mean,
it'll be a hard habit for some hunters to break.
Yeah.
What are the risks to your hunting dogs? If you have a retriever with you and he goes out and picks up a sick bird, is there any risk to the dog?
Yes. I would say that, the risk to dogs is probably greater than to the humans, if only because, if a dog, just thinking about a dog seeing a dead bird, they might, if it's a bird that you think was healthy and you hunted it, then that is a bit different. But if they're out with you and there happen to be dead animals that they come across, and they're going to pick those up, then maybe that's a higher risk. So it would be, maybe trying to avoid that situation. But there haven't been as many cases in dogs that I've seen, and there's been at least one that I know of. And that was, early on in this outbreak, there was some recommendations of, when you're walking your dogs in the neighborhood, that sort of thing, to just be aware of, if you do see a dead bird or an affected bird, like, don't let your dog near it, because, there is a risk of infection and ingestion. And I think, there's that one case of a dog, and that was in Ontario. And there, serious infection after ingestion is occurring. There's more and more cases of that happening in cats now, which, cats and dogs are different, but it is another, a companion animal that ingests something that is infected and getting severely sick. So I think it's, again, probably not a huge risk, but something that you would want to be aware of if you are taking your dog out. To just, don't let them go after, sick or dead animals that you've noticed. The same thing as with a human, but that it might be a little bit more unavoidable, if they're picking up the scent and they are going to retrieve something and they come across, another animal that happens to be laying there. Right. It might be a little bit harder to avoid, but that's something to think about.
Yeah. With humans, a lot of our influenza is more in the winter months. Is there more of a concern in the spring versus the fall? I haven't seen a lot of sick birds in the fall, and we normally hear of influenzas as the migration continues further into the States and there's bigger concentrations and the weather cools down. But warm September weather doesn't seem to have much occurrence in my mind. But birds returning in the spring, it seems to be more prevalent. Is there any tie to that?
Yeah. So this is something like, that we used to talk about a little bit, because, generally, with high path avian influenza and avian influenza in general, you would see incursions of the virus, during migratory season. So, they come back in the spring and then they leave in the fall. And then, as, birds are flying over these major flyways, then you would see, maybe an uptick in the incidence of infection in certain areas. But during this larger outbreak the last several years, that seasonality hasn't been quite as obvious. And so it seems like, I think as the virus has sort of spread to many more species, it just has hung around a little bit more, and in species that aren't migratory potentially, and then, in other, in mammals and in and then in poultry and in settings where the birds can come and pick it up at any point rather than it just circulating in the migratory species. I think that's impacted it. So I would say, like, historically, there would be maybe a greater risk during those migratory seasons, but that seems to not be the case as much so right now, and that just speaks to, I think, how widespread the virus is becoming, in so many species. So I don't know anything about the bird hunting seasons, but I think, generally the message in terms of, risk, I think, would be applicable sort of across the board at this point.
Okay. Viruses. If hunters clean birds regularly during the fall using the same knives and the meat tubs, can you disinfect them with bleach or other things to kill any of the virus to know that they're safe to use for any food handling?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And if you've been, preparing birds with one set of knives or different tools, you can definitely, household bleach definitely is effective. That will clean it. If you just use, your basic soap and water, that is pretty good as well. Just thoroughly use it. You can use alcohol-based sanitizer as well, and then you can just let that dry, and that will kill most of the virus, or if not all of it as well. So there are a few different ways that you can try to maintain sort of food safety and keep everything sanitized.
Does freezing your birds before you cook them help to kill the virus or control it at all?
Okay. Yeah, good question. I would say that probably wouldn't. I mean, freezing would kill certainly some of the virus. It depends where the virus is, like if it's in the meat, if it's on the surface, that sort of thing. Generally, if you've frozen something at, it would be, in your standard, deep freeze or something like that, the virus can survive in there for, probably a pretty extended period of time. When you go to thaw the meat afterward, a good portion of that virus probably will be dead, but there's a good chance that there would still be some present. So just freezing and thawing, I would still be taking the same precautions as I would if I was handling a fresh animal.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. When we're done, cleaning our birds and stuff, and we have the carcasses and stuff like that, how would you recommend getting rid of them?
That's a good question. I think if you have no reason to suspect that, the birds are infected, I think they can be, discarded the same way that any other carcass or food is discarded. If there's any reason at all that you think that an animal might have been infected, then I would contact there's a regional avian influenza hotline for every area in Canada. I think maybe each province, or maybe more than one per province, and then there's a Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. These are contacts that would come and handle any potentially infectious animals. I don't think I would do anything out of the ordinary unless you suspect that there's a reason that they're infected. Again, if you are, I wouldn't just chuck a carcass, outside. I wouldn't let an animal, have a chance to eat it, that sort of thing. If it goes into the regular sort of compost, then, the virus won't survive for a terribly long time in that. And so I don't think it's a huge risk.
Good. It's interesting you brought up the basic hotlines for reporting the diseases. Why is it important to report them?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, there's a few different angles. Probably the most important is, it's good for each regional area, to know of any cases. So we want to identify as many possible cases as we can, because then that can alert, the wildlife authorities in the region. It can keep the producers of poultry aware if there's circulating, cases around. It gives us more data on the types of species that can be infected, because, we assume that, most of the species of birds and different animals, potentially are susceptible to some degree, but we don't have data obviously on all these, and every data point helps. Typically when they do the testing, so if there's a sick or dead animal, they'll test it, and if it's positive, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in Winnipeg will sequence the virus, and then we'll get information on how it's mutated, how it's changed, and then that can help us with, contact tracing down the road. So if a poultry operation becomes infected and they have to cull, thousands of birds, down the road, we can look at that virus and we can say, okay, this matches the virus that we detected, in southern Alberta at this time. This must be circulating here, and this is how it's moved, and this is how it's evolved. So that all helps. And then again, if you encounter a sick or dead bird as a hunter, that's also good information for other hunters to say, okay, I was hunting in this area and I found a sick or dead bird. Other hunters should be aware of this as well. And so as much information for everyone as possible always helps.
Right. Well, I think that the general public can play a role in this. One last question for you. It's not hunting related, but what else can we do to help prevent the spread of avian influenza? Should backyard bird feeders be taken down until there's a break in this problem?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the biggest thing is sort of, general public awareness and, sort of citizen science and citizen, surveillance. And if you do see something, obviously reporting it and helping to, if you report that as soon as possible, maybe we can get those animals taken care of and out of, if you remove a dead animal, that eliminates the possibility of, another animal coming into contact. The question about backyard feeders, I mean, I think it's mainly a question of where you live. I mean, if you live in the city and you have, like a birdhouse or a small feeder, there's probably not a huge risk there. It's probably not contributing to anything. There's not a lot of data or reports of infection in songbirds and those types of birds that will come into your backyard feeder. But if you live in a rural area or you have an acreage or a farm and you have feeders there, or you have large bird baths or standing water or dugouts and things like that, where different bird species that aren't just your standard like sparrows and those city birds, if those are coming and feeding and pooping in that water, then that could be a transmission risk. So I think that sort of situation is one where maybe you want to get rid of at least your bird bath, if not your feeder as well. I think it really just depends on where you are in that situation. But it really, if everyone is aware of it, I think that helps. It's a tall task to stop the transmission of it now. It seems to just be getting worse and worse now, but we'll hopefully get some headway there over the next little while.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, because you've actually helped people understand what influenza is, how it's impacting not only domestic birds but wild birds, what people can do that like to hunt, feed birds in their backyard. The information, I think, is very critical and important, especially at this juncture of the disease changing and bad outbreaks across North America. So I appreciate your time and effort to help inform the public and hunters.
Yeah, no problem. I was happy to do it, and hopefully the information is useful to your listeners.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we appreciate your time. We hope to inspire people to reconnect with nature and appreciate where your food comes from by harvesting your own. For more information on getting started or to learn specifics about the Field to Fork experience, visit harvestyourown.ca and follow on Facebook and Instagram. Check back often for new material, recipes, and videos that are posted regularly. Please subscribe to Harvest Your Own podcast and take the time to rate and review the show to help us build a dedicated core of passionate hunters as our regular audience. Until next time, embrace the outdoors and all it has to offer. Thanks for joining us.